Hello, and welcome to the Sound on Sound podcast channel about electronic music and all things synth. I'm Rob Puricelli, and in this episode I talk to Dr. Manny Fernandez, a man whose name might not instantly ring any bells, FM or otherwise. But whilst you may not have heard his name, you will have almost certainly heard his sounds that have featured heavily in almost all of Yamaha's FM synths, from the DX7 Mark II right up to today's Montage and MODX workstations. Tell me a little bit about Manny Fernandez before Yamaha. What was your first musical interest? What sparked the enthusiasm?
We are fortunate that a close family friend of ours was a top-flight jazz and LA studio guy, and he had a home studio. So I got exposed to an Odyssey many moons ago, and his kids and me and my brother, we would jam in his studio when he was out working, and that was sort of my first exposure to electronics. Was an Odyssey way back in, I want to say, about 78.
And then where did it progress from there? So what was your first, what was the first synthesizer you owned?
Well, thankfully I didn't have to buy my own for a while because I had access to borrowing a lot of gear from our friend's dad. So I got to play with JX3Ps, Prophet 5s, Rhodes Chroma, Prophet T8, all that kind of fun stuff, and moving his gear around and getting it set up for him. So I didn't really have to buy my own gear until I went off to college, and then that's when I was able to buy a Pro 1. So I bought that brand new, and shortly thereafter acquired the Odyssey from our friend's dad, and that was the first two synths I owned.
You mentioned that you were doing programming for this friend's father, and was that how you got the bug into sound design for synthesizers? Was that where it all started?
Yeah, I mean, basically that's where it started, being able to just have a synth that you could just twiddle around and figure out what it does. Because at that point, it wasn't anything that it was learned. I was in high school and just twiddled around there when we got together and played with me and my brother and his sons in his studio, just doodling around.
These were synthesizers that were didn't have any patch memory, so you were creating stuff and then it was gone. And then
start all over, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But that's a big philosophy that I'm actually a big fan of, things that disappear.
Before we get to your time with Yamaha and the FM synthesis of the DX7, how was your progression to that point? Did you get into sampling at all? Did you have any exposure to other digital technology? Were you aware of what was going on with Dr. John Chowning?
Right. So when I was in college, what was interesting is that after I was there for 2 years, I found out that we had a really nifty electronic music studio at our college. I went to a college called UC Davis, which is outside of Sacramento here in California, and its nearest neighbor is UC Berkeley. And so the gentleman in our electronic music department was out of Berkeley and was very close with Don Buchla. So I had no idea we had a full 200 modular system, a little electronic music easel in the suitcase, sitting here in a studio for anybody who signed up for the class to have unlimited access to. So that was like, oh, hello, because I was in college from 79 to 83. That's when all the synth bands hit, big internationally. And so that's what was my initial interest, is that kind of stuff from a pop rock kind of standpoint. But I was also into the let's call it the ambient orchestral mishmashes, so Tangerine Dream, those kinds of things. So I listened to all the stuff. So that's what drove me to learn analog synthesis, and I started taking the university classes to learn all the classic techniques. We literally started with tape loops, music concrete, editing your sounds as tones on cutting blocks. Your envelopes are the shape you cut the tape. and going through the whole history of everything and learning all the science behind subtractive synthesis. And about this time, digital synthesis was also coming online, and I picked up a album, one of the early Larry Fast Synergy albums.
Oh, yes.
And it had a section on one of his tunes that was generated on the digital system that Max Matthews put together back on the East Coast, which eventually became the GDS. And it was very enlightening to hear this rapid agitato solo string line, that the harmonic structure on it was just so crisp and precise in the middle of his washes of analog stuff. I'm going, hey, what the hell is that? And that's when I started trying to figure out, what's available for that. So right at the time I graduated university is when this first synclavier came out, which came out of Stanford, which again is very local to where I was. And that was just like a level of control and specificity of control that just really interested me. Because the more I got into synthesis, the more I wanted to create exactly what structures I wanted to with the control I wanted of them. So when the year I graduated, which was '83, is the year the DX7 came out. Make a little side trip. I would drive into San Francisco regularly to check out stuff at the music stores, and the original GS1 and GS2 had already made their debut. And one of the original programmers for Yamaha, Gary Leuenberger, had a very nice store in San Francisco, and I would go there on the weekends and hang out for hours playing gear I could never afford. So I would just clomp around on that, and again, had some experience on playing those instruments. Back in those days, nothing was programmable. But that's what really got my ear into, these machines are just really cool. So then when the DX7 came out, I just had to get one. Was able to get one probably 4 or 5 months after it actually was released. Thankfully, my friend's dad, had some connections to get gear whenever. So I got my DX7 probably, I want to say maybe June, July, August at the latest of '83. Went right to the University of Southern California academic library and picked out all of Channing's research and started reading it and started playing around and started deconstructing all the sounds. And that's how I transitioned from analog to digital, and that's how I got into digital.
So you came at it obviously from a synclavier route, because if I'm not mistaken, synclavier sub-licensed the technology from Yamaha, who had licensed it from Stanford. So
correct.
You kind of came at it through that correct route, so to speak.
Yes, and because New England Digital had the first implementation of it out there, because the synclavier 1 predated the GS1 and GS2, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So then you got to the DX7, which, to for want of a better word, simplified FM synthesis compared to what had gone before. Now you had this programmable system, but it was very menu driven, not at all analog like. Then you said you took Dr. John Chowning's research and started getting into the weeds and breaking stuff down. So you kind of reverse engineered stuff.
Well, yeah. To explain how that sort of goes is that it's like I had it on order, I was waiting for it, so it's like, well, let's start figuring out what it does. And so what's interesting is in the generation of the commercially available FM synthesizers, compared to the original synclavier implementation, the GS1, the GS2, and the DX7, the DX7 is actually the most complex implementation of it. It just so happens that like anything computer or chip based, the first things are really expensive and all the trickle downs get cheaper as the power goes up. So the synclavier was single operator pairs, 4 of them. The GS1 and GS2 were similarly these types of pairs. They had some interesting, interactions on a couple of them, but they did not have the massive algorithm choices that you had in the DX7. But getting back to the research, it's like, okay, this is something completely different. I know nothing about it. Let's start figuring out how it works. So that's why I pulled the research up, because I knew we were building things from nothing, starting with sine waves, and I wanted to get some direction on, what I was going to expect when I started changing ratios and modulation index and all that. And so one of the things that struck me most about looking at his papers were all the graphs that he had of the index, harmonic, the phase inversions, the Bessel function math, and all that stuff, to realize that they called it linear FM, which is the process of which it modulates frequency, but in reality, the responses that you got were anything but linear. So that came in really handy when I started deconstructing the sounds that came in the presets and started doing my own sounds, already kind of knowing it was not going to respond any way that I was familiar with from an analog synth. And I think that's what got me over the hump that so many guys didn't get over, is that it was so different than an analog synth. I mean, forget the single slider in the menus. It was just like, it didn't do what you thought it was going to do.
Yeah. I have a friend who's a big analog synthesis fan, and we have lots of discussions about the merits and the shortcomings of both analog and digital. And the one thing he says that he doesn't like about FM is the unpredictability, the fact that you don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen when you change a particular setting. Whereas with an analog paradigm, whether it's an ARP Odyssey, a Pro 1, a CS80, if you grab hold of the filter cutoff, you know what to expect. Would you kind of go along with that?
Yes, and I love this question, because in a lot of conversations I've had with guys at Yamaha and other people regarding, how I approach and how I look at that, there's a tiny disconnect that a lot of people miss, which is ear training and experience. It's only unpredictable because it's not similar to what you already have learned. And for me, in knowing the background and then pulling apart and deconstructing the presets, I was using all that time to train my, let's just call it, in other words, getting a sonic memory of what happens when if I do X, Y happens. So this gets down to something that I've been told John Chowning says as well. You don't need to know anything about how FM works. You just need to hear at what happens when you do something. And if you like it, do more. And if you don't, do something else, which honestly is how you approach analog synthesis. The difference is that one comes from building something from nothing. So there's a lot more work to do, as opposed to having something and taking it out, which subtractive is mostly what happens in analog. So you can't screw up analog per se, okay? But you can build something very unusual in FM. But at the end, people have asked me this. It's like, after, how do you program now? It's like, I do it all by ear. But it's because I have all the experience of, I've tweaked so many interactions for, in so many variations. It's like, I kind of have a sonic memory of what's going to happen. Is it going to be exactly? No, but that's what you tweak. You tweak by ear. So over the years in, talking about how to approach X, Y, Z or whatever, people say, but what's the algorithm you need to do for that kind of sound? I go, any of them. What do you mean? Well, any of them, doesn't matter. There's nothing special about an algorithm. When people say, well, how do you know if you need a 1 to 3 or a 2 to 3 or a 1 to 4? It's like, well, okay, the math tells me I'm going to kind of get a ballpark, but at the end of the day, you got to just pick one and say, does that sound like how I want it to hear? So, it's like, the best way to explain it is like, everybody knows how to color with some crayons, but, not everybody can take a palette of oils and make a fantastic painting, okay, without a lot of practice, okay? Yes, more practice is needed in FM because it builds from nothing in ways that have a much wider tamper range, frankly, than subtractive synthesis does. So you have more work to do. And you just have to put the time in. And if you have good ears, you take the time. It's actually not that hard.
Because that is the perennial comeback with FM, is that it's just so darn difficult to get something out of it. That's what people always say, and it's what I always come up against when I talk about it is, oh, it's just so hard to program, and you have to go through menu diving. There's not enough knobs per function, and I get that, and I see recent efforts in terms of third-party controllers and software things that supposedly make that process easier. Do you, when you're programming with FM, do you use the controls on the synthesizer? Do you use software editors? Have you got third-party controllers? What's your process?
That is a very interesting question that you're going to get a totally bizarre answer. A factor of how long I've done this and how many weird breadboards on a box I've had to use. In general, I'm a front panel guy, in general. However, an appropriately designed computer editor is very useful, but I have some very strange idea on what that entails. And that is, for me, the ideal editor for an FM synth is essentially what they have up on Yamaha Sound Mondo for their Reface DX.
Oh, yes.
Okay, or how some of the old Commodore 64 editors were, which is, I just want a spreadsheet with numbers. That's really all I want, but because I know what all those numbers mean at this point. And so when I'm using an editor, what I like is I just like to put numbers in by 10 key. I like to tab, shift, tab, and use cursor controls to navigate to my box, and I can literally spreadsheet up a sound in no time. So I do use them when they are that type. I've done a lot of work for Yamaha recently on Montage, and they have a reasonable development editor, but in a weird way, since the navigations don't work the way that are comfortable for me from a speed standpoint, I basically program on the front panel.
So it's the mid-1980s. You've got your DX7. You are learning it inside out from research notes and your own experience. What happens that gets you to the DX7 Mark II and programming those sounds that I guess for FM nerds like me are some of the best FM sounds out there? What was that process from owning a DX7 to getting to work on them?
Right. So basically, at that time, I was just doing it for my own fun. Again, I was doing work for my friend's dad, because he also would use a DX in the studio, and playing live with our own band. I got the DX7 II right when it came out, just because it was like, well, a lot of people loved the 12-bit grunge, the DX7 I. Okay. For me, it was more annoying than it was pleasurable. And so in being able to play with a DX5 and seeing the fact that you could dual up these things, I thought to myself, hey, well, that's really, really cool. So when that came out, the fact that it had the floppy drive and it had the dual engine, it's like, okay, I'm all over that. So I bought that, again, very early on. So in those 3 or 4 year period of time, I had struck up a very good friendship with a owner of a local mom and pop music store. And when he had the DX7 II, I used to do custom libraries for him. Because at the time, when you would buy from Guitar Center or Sam Ash or whomever, and you were buying any Yamaha gear, everybody wanted to know, what library do I get at it? Because no one was going to program the thing. So I started doing just stuff for him, so he had his own custom library. And then first inflection point was you went from analog to digital. And then you went from digital Rev 1 or Gen 1 to digital Rev 2 because, you always had Fairlight, you always had emulators and stuff like that, and they were trying to, mix all these technologies. So, the DX7 and its sound, it was different, it was great. Where could you get 16 notes of aftertouch velocity sensitivity for $2,000 when a Jupiter 8 was $4,000, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So obviously, for better or worse, it took over the market for synthesizers. And then you had phase 2, and phase 2 was the D50. And the D50 introduced sample snippets, but more importantly, onboard FX. So now there's a whole nother different sound, that came in that was different. So the fact I was doing custom work for my friend's store when, D50 came in, that was where everybody was gravitating to, because now it was the next shiny light bulb to gather everybody to. So he said, that's just so sad, Manny. I said, I know you love the FM stuff, but it's kind of like dead because, we're just not moving this. Everybody wants the D50s. It's got like the new sound. I go, show me what it is that everybody comes in and goes, wow. So he, played me a bunch of sounds. And I said, okay. So about 2.5 weeks later, he came back with a disc. Okay, hey, George, check this out. He loaded up. And that's where I started doing what became sort of the sound sets that you talked about, which was utilizing FM to emulate, quote, other synthesis types. Or more importantly, just showing again the breadth of FM that is possible using techniques that I don't want to say aren't readily evident, but again, mother of necessity, as it were. And that is, how do you make something that sounds chorused? How do you add some of these, breathy noise bursts? How do you add things that are like pseudo reverb tails to give it, let's just call it a non-FM sound? And so I made a disc of, copying what he told me was everybody's favorite, D50 patches. A lot of them were just dual voices, appropriately done. There was a couple of them that were unison poly, because that was one of the key features, unison poly and the multi-LFO mode, that you could turn off the synchronization in terms of creating things that were very, Fairlighty, synclavier, D50-ish, and just doing that. So we, named them all the same voice names. So if somebody came in and just said, I want this, that, but then they still wanted the DX, what it could do, which the D50 couldn't in terms of a wider timbre range, then he started selling DX7s again, and abnormally so. His rep was like, seriously, this store is just one guy. His mom worked in the back booking the music lessons. He had 2 part-time college kids helping out, and he was selling on a monthly basis as many more DX7s than Guitar Center was in LA. And so his rep said, what's going on? He says, well, I have this disc, and you need to talk to this guy. He's programming for me. Maybe he should do some work for you. So that's sort of the long story. So eventually my name filtered into Yamaha, and I got called to do a rescue project. And what the rescue project was to officially do voicing of the DX7-2 to have sounds that were all in the timbre space that was popular for everything that was going on right at that time. So we did a series of a number of titles, and the guys that were also involved doing that from market research and other standpoints were the core that ended up forming SoundSource Unlimited back in the day. So we did a bunch of accessories voice sets, and it culminated into doing the FDE project. The gray matter board had come out for the Mark II, which increased a lot of capabilities for it. And that was a really cool thing that before other workstation type things were out there, so even before the M1, Yamaha had the ability to make their DX7-2 a workstation. They decided to make it an official product because people couldn't get the boards installed necessarily unless they were in the right metropolitan area. So we went into the warehouse and we opened them up, we installed them all, we soldered the boards, we loaded up the sounds, and Yamaha USA had a special SKU number that was the FDE that you could buy from a store ready to rock. And so that bought it some more time again until the M1 came around, and basically that was the transition of the last curve of that level of FM for Yamaha.
So not only the dawn of a new form of synthesis and kind of mass production, but also the dawn of a whole new industry that you became heavily involved with presets. Before then, there weren't many programmable synthesizers with memory patches. Obviously, the Prophet 5 had those, but getting that data between machines was virtually impossible. Along comes the DX7, which has MIDI, of course, which you can transmit data between, but it also has the all-important cartridge slot as well as the tape interface. And so now the distribution of preset sounds was just easy to do. So very fortuitous time for you to fall into that, really, I suppose.
Well, yeah, and you sort of hit the nail on the head there, which was DX7 was one of the original MIDI devices, and at that point you were starting to see the original patch editors and librarians and such, and because it was awkward to program, that did definitely start the third-party business. Here in the States, one of the first companies to really start that for the DX was a company called KeyClick, which was started by Bo Tomlin, who was a LA session guy who had a lot of involvement with Yamaha at that time as well. And back in those days, just with the MIDI interface, it was still on the 5 1/4 soft floppies. That was the format. Of course, there are also people, and they did as well, sold the cartridges. But the price of the cartridges was tough for real big mass market, because a blank cartridge from Yamaha at the time was like $90, blank, and unless you were going to make ROMs, everybody was just overwriting RAM carts, and the upfront cost to do that was high. So, but some companies did actually do some custom ROMs, especially in Japan. A lot of stuff came out. But yeah, the DX7 was really well supported with third-party sounds, either through computer loading disks or special ROM or RAM cartridges for a number period of time. But it was still sort of niche, just because the costs were relatively expensive. But the Mark II, since it had the disk drive, that really was a game changer, because you could cut the cost significantly for the user, because floppy disks were not expensive and they were not expensive to duplicate. And so it really took off. And of course, everything else around it started coming out. Remember, and Sonic Mirage was starting to hit around this time. And so you had the libraries for sample disks. Yamaha had the TX16W, and samplers were starting to come out. They were at probably the 3rd or 4th generation emulator. They're probably up to emulator 2, and people that bought that, you were just buying those disks. So as more of the computer-based digital synths, started coming to market, there was more of that. And so, yeah, it really expanded as other guys, came onto line. You got your K2000s, Kawai, everybody was diving into the market, and they all needed sounds. And so, it expanded really quickly.
So the DX7 Mark II has had its time in the spotlight. It's fading away. New boys are coming on the block. Yamaha move on to the SY and the TG range, which brings in samples, in a similar way to Roland and the way they brought samples in. But Yamaha are now mixing FM with sample technology. And how different was that for you to now embrace this world of digital sampling?
So it's kind of interesting. I'm going to give you a little historical lineage on that transition, because when you look at the 80s and you look at what were the kings of the market, you had your DX7, then you had your D50, then you had your M1. And the M1 was, D50 on steroids, quote, full samples, workstation capabilities, better effects, more sophisticated, mixing on that. So that's what set sort of the template of the modern synthesizer, for better or worse, that we still see today in a lot of implementations. And so Yamaha had nothing in that space, and a DX7 with E was a very, in the hands of somebody who would take the time, it was definitely usable, but it was, just a bunch of hacks and, things to get it set up and going. So they embarked on developing their next status of technology. So what was interesting is the development cycle of a whole new thing from scratch that was outside of their thinking was going to take a certain period of time. So they were looking for a way to leverage a workstation, full-on workstation products using their existing technology. So they brought in the gray matter response guys because they knew how to implement multi-timbrality on their FM chips, the sequencer functions, and all that stuff. And so they were trying to develop FM-based systems that we actually got to protos and showed at NAMM called the Yamaha V80. And of course, the V50 was the little brother of that. And it's kind of interesting on those two products because the V80 was quite an interesting beast because it actually had as part of its spec the expansion boards that they later had with all their PLG stuff, you know, in the CS6X, the S80s, and all that stuff, and that it was going to ship with the full-blown sequencer and just an FM engine, but you had slots where you could put your sample playback card, you could put your drum machine card, you could put all these cards in, and we showed all that at NAMM in private suite, and it got some, you know, pretty good responses because it integrated the effects and all that. And I don't want to say at the last minute, but the engineers were looking at that, looking at what they were going to be able to do to actually get the support. In other words, when you're going to get the drum machine card is really what it came down to. Because until they got that, I mean, I love FM drums, and I'm pretty proud of all the FM drum work that I've done that are fine to do stuff with, but you really needed to have the sampled drums to play. So they killed the product because the engineers said, we've got next gen SY coming along and we can move it up and get it out in X time frame. So rightly so, they didn't want to spend the money to tool up literally a temporary 1-year product. But what they ended up doing was fast tracking and getting the V50 going. So Yamaha's first workstation was the V50. And it's actually a really cool box, in all honesty, you know, because it's got the effects chips, it's got drum samples, it's got a 4-op engine, you know, it's got the same engine as the TX81Z, and it's a really cool little box. So they bought their little bit of time with the V50 until the SY series came out. So the SY was originally conceived to basically be their version of an M1 Plus. And the Plus was they were going to have multiple synthesis systems because they obviously had all this FM technology. So they developed their own sample playback system, which was AWM, which is literally what an M1 is, multi-samples, filters, and a sequencer. But they developed AFM, which was their next generation FM. And they put these two things together. And in the box, it was really kind of cool. And I've spoken about this in some other venues, in that AFM and AWM can be used interactively in something that Yamaha calls real-time convolution modulation, or RCM, which is using a sample as a waveform as a modulator of FM. So as much as the DX7 was just sine waves, the 81Z and the DX100 had, I think, their 6 or 8 waveforms that they had. The AFM had 16 waveform choices, but now you could go really complex with a sample. I don't want to know if to say the intent, but one of the things that they had hoped to accomplish with their synthesis engine is utilizing that interaction as a resynthesizer. So this is going to get a little technical for a bit, but Yamaha FM is not frequency modulation, it's phase modulation.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's a lot of very important reasons why they do that. The number one reason for it is it's much more simple to implement in their chips, but it also does something very important. Without getting out of the frequency and going to phase, you can't do feedback. Or let's just say you can't do feedback the way you need to. Because if you implement feedback in true FM, the pitch center changes as feedback changes. So in real time, you can't change a modulation index of a feedback operator. Otherwise, it's not what you want. But when you do it as phase modulation, you can. And so the Yamaha expansion of the original Chowning FM algorithm was implementing feedback. Now, why is feedback important? It's important for a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons why it's important is something you talked about, how guys aren't used to how FM works. Feedback tames, or maybe a better way to say it is, feedback analogs up harmonic response with index. So it makes it behave more in tune to how a filter does. So it tames all the peaks and valleys in those Bessel functions so that you can get a sound brighter without changing the core balance of the inner harmonics. So that's how it came to be. So looping back around, why is this important? AFM in the SY series, besides the waveforms, actually also gave you phase control of every operator. So you have initial phase control. And what that does is that allows for basically frequency shifting of whatever modulator is coming into it. So the early stages of the SY algorithm, when you dive into the pages, they had something that would show up in the little screen of all the little patch points as OPH. And OPH was how they set up the FM section to be interacted from the sample section, instead of using Chowning's equation, to use their modification of what's called a Hilbert transform. I'm going to butcher this, so anybody who knows all this specifically, don't put in the comment section. But basically, you can analyze audio signals, extract a bunch of phase information from them, and then use less complex signals to reconstruct the original one by reconstructing the phase. So RCM, the original intent was to get dynamic samples playing back by utilizing the phase, reconstructing phase information in real time from all these FM operators. So by having different phase shifts, different waveforms, and different velocity sensitivities and keyboard scalings and kind of stuff, you could now take a static sample and get a harmonic playability that was more in tune to what a multi-sample would sound like, but just using one sample. That was their goal of it. For a myriad of reasons, it did not work as planned. So it was removed, and they left the patch point there, where you can feed your sample in, but it's just regular straight FM math. And so a lot of people over the years was like, wow, we got this new, and they go, but what do we do with it? So here is the issue that, it's not my issue, but people say, it doesn't seem very useful. And if you understand the math of FM, you'll understand why, is that FM does not need complex harmonic structures because the interaction generates tons of harmonics. So when you start using complex waveforms as modulators, you have a very limited range of modulation index before you just get, I don't want to say unusable noise, but it just gets very, very harsh very, very quickly. And one of the other quirks is that when you use a sample, all the harmonics are recorded from the original instrument, and those aren't also perfectly in tune, which means you have all these out of tune things interacting with in tune things, because the first 5 harmonics are in tune, then all the upper harmonics are all skewed sharp, and then they all come down. So that's why it does that. But what is interesting is Yamaha included a bunch of stuff in digital waves, which are what I call reduced harmonic complex waves. Those are the waves you want to do all your RCM stuff with, okay? Because now you have timbre spaces that you have that are unique, but they don't get out of control. But, you know, taking the piano sample and trying to throw it through the FM thing to make a super piano, okay, basically doesn't work. Okay, or let's just say doesn't work well. Do I have stuff that does it to give more playability? Yeah, but, you know, it's like a 10% gain. And that's just because you don't want to use a ton of harmonic content as a modulator, because it just gets out of control really quick.
So SYTG moves onwards, and I can't remember if there was anything specific between those, and because I think Yamaha just decided that FM really wasn't where it was at anymore until the 90s, and we saw the emergence of the FS1R module, which again was horribly confusing to most people because it's this 1U rack mount, but it's got probably, certainly to my ears, because I don't own one unfortunately, but to my ears it's one of the most beautiful sounding FM engines, and it also builds in formant shaping, which, if my research is correct, Dr. Chowning said was the next logical step for that form of synthesis was to introduce formant shaping, and this module flopped. It was only around for about a year or so, and yet now it's one of the most sought after objects of many synthesists. I mean, I've been looking for one for years, and whenever they come up, they're ridiculously priced. But you worked on that one. So how did you find that implementation of FM?
Yeah. What's really interesting is, I hope you won't find this story just superfluous, but Yamaha has always had an interesting manner in which they implement things in their synthesizers. And it goes back to their CS series, in terms of like they do destination routing as opposed to source routing, or some things just kind of like are quirky on how it puts together. And it's not good or bad, but they just have a weird way of doing things. And one of the things that for me in the SY, it's got really, really good sounding digital filters, but their implementation is exquisitely quirky. And to get them to do what you would normally do on an M1 or whatever derivative is actually kind of a pain in the butt. You can do it, it's just that it's so much more work than it needs to be. And then the way that you do things like add velocity sensitivities to it and modulation depths, it's just weird. So the FS comes around, and there's two things that are really cool about the FS1R. One is it's the first synth that let me take that back. They kind of fixed this all in the EX5 and the EX7. They finally did filters like the rest of the world, meaning on how you apply your modulations, all that stuff. Plus it was multi-mode. And one of the things that happened between FS and DX7 and SY is the one you see behind me, which people don't realize is important for another reason, which is the VL. The VL, besides being a physical model, also did much more sophisticated filter modeling and effects modeling. And so that was carried through the EX5. And so Yamaha is really getting much better at doing their modeling of everything. So now you get the FS1R, and you have multimode filters that sound really good. And the structure of it is basically carried through to what's in Montage. I mean, they have basically kept just, improving clock speeds and stuff of those implementations. So that's cool. And then, the velocity works right, the modulations to attack rates and all that stuff. Everything works the way you anticipate it to work. So they fixed it up, and that's really cool. And then the second half is that they have this new engine that has the noise operators and the format behavior of the regular operators. So it's very interesting when we were doing that project because, sometimes we get things that are very well specified, and sometimes we get things dropped in our lap that fall under we don't know what it does. The VLs was obviously one of those projects. We know what we designed it to, but we really don't know what it does in a musically useful way. And so the FS was kind of like that as well. The mindset of the development of it is, what is FM good for? And that is dynamic harmonic response that is very, quote, acoustic or real instrument sounding. But what is it not so good at? Well, it's not so good at noises, and if you really want to do acoustic instruments, there's lots of harmonic content, there's a lot of noise content, and there's a lot of format behaviors. So that's where they said, okay, well, let's just put this together. So we get this plopped down, and we start to play around with it. Now we got to figure out what the hell we're going to do with it. And we found a couple of really interesting things that you can do with this box. One is it's a very lo-fi sampler, which some guys have really, thought is really cool use of it. It's also an exquisitely versatile vocoding type of device. And then it is now a enhanced FM engine and FM synthesizer as well. So you have all these capabilities in the box that you can't see a dang thing from the front panel, with 4 knobs and menu diving that's just like, ugh. Now, thankfully, I never programmed it from the front panel. I always had a dev system that, eventually a version of it was what was released with the editor that came in the box, because you have to program in the box. But what was interesting in what we were doing with this is something else that they did, which was it read original DX7 SysX. So what was cool about that was, enough time had passed that it was kind of like a little bit of an FM, renaissance. But more importantly, hundreds of thousands of sounds that you could fly into this box. And so you could use them just as is, but more importantly, you could put great sounding filters on it, great sounding effects. So a lot of stuff that people wanted to always do with their DX7, you could do right off the bat. So what we started to do was to enhance those voices for better acoustic control, as it were. So we would take these formant operators to build in formants in the guitar sounds, in the Rhodes sounds, use the noise operators to do more thunks and clicks and clacks and pick noises, and put all these things on the knobs on the front of it so that you could actually control some of this stuff in real time. This is just speculation on my part, because it literally, you couldn't use it without a computer, okay? And if you didn't like what was unique about it, which was that weird lo-fi sampler, vocoded type of sound, okay, it was sort of like lost in the market, as it were. And so yeah, it was a failure to the degree that, they were, I don't want to say they couldn't give them away, but they were selling them ridiculously cheap to dealers. They were offering ridiculously cheap to employees. So, but regardless of what it goes for today, I'm smiling because you say you've been looking for one. I have one new in box, unopened, sitting on my shelf that I bought for $350 back when they gave them away. And it's still in the box. But what's interesting about it is, like anything, when things are really cheap, a lot of people get access to it that wouldn't otherwise, and they find some unique way to use it. So some people think this is like totally off the wall, but it is absolutely, completely accurate as an analogy. So the FS1R has become legendary for the exact same reason that the Roland 808 drum machine and the TB303 did, which was they were flops, they were dirt cheap, a bunch of people got them, and then found some new thing to do with it. And that's what happened with the FS1R, is that when you had the chance to dive into it, it's like, wow, this does a lot. And more so than other Yamaha products, it suffered from, the disease that all of us call shipping deadlines.
Right.
How much can you accomplish in the sound set on the time frame that you have available? So the thing that it just became really known for is these, weird use of the format sequences and all these weird form behaviors, throwing them on controllers, and it was a texture and a sound that if you're into certain, types of musical genres, it's the only thing that can do it, and it sounds fantastic doing it. And so a number of very creative individuals started turning out content with it, and people go, "What the hell's that?" And so it's a really cool box. The approach that I had from programming it is very similar to what I do with everything I get from Yamaha, which is they give it to us. There's a spec. There's an outline of what's supposed to do, and I throw that right out, and I start poking in all the places to try to literally do everything it's not supposed to. In other words, the first thing I do with any of their systems is I try to break them. So I investigate the extremes of every parameter. Whatever, if nobody in a million years would want to patch this to that, well, I'm going to do that first. Because again, I want to find out what quirks it has, because if I want to make cool, interesting stuff, in my experience, those are always in the cracks of the synthesis system, so you want to find those right away. So they gave me the original analysis software to generate the format sequences and stuff. And so I really played in a really wide spectrum of totally ridiculously avant-garde stuff to very standard DX stuff to try to find what the sweet spot of it was. And for me, what I wrote this in a report, and I said, I think how you're going to catch most people's attention with this is what it does in a pseudo vocoder sense, because that is usable without having to be editable, whereas using it as a lo-fi sampler, you can't unless you have all the software and all that kind of stuff. So I suggested a bunch of stuff. I gave them a bunch of examples of things that I thought you should have for format sequences, and sent it off to them. Next thing I know, things that I suggested to them to do professionally, they ended up generating off the cassettes I sent them. I literally sent them, cassette, because a digital file, back in those days to transfer over the internet was like, ridiculous. So I gave them a chromium cassette of a bunch of things that I thought would make for good format sequences of me doing them vocally. Some of them were, whatever sounds. Some of them were just, I don't want to have to build, by scratch. It's like analyze those things. So I was just doing things like that to pop stuff in. So anyway, I just thought it was hilarious that, oh, really? You used what I sent you? But the first demo in it, utilizes that aspect of it, which is the what I call the chordal vocoding. It's a monophonic format sequence that you can play over chordal voicings that gives you a really cool talking synthesizer thing. But it also has format sequences that you get those timbre shifts over moving harmonic structures that you can't generate any other way. And yeah, it's a really cool box that nobody appreciated in its time.
So the FS1R brought in this, it wasn't the first, obviously, because there was an 8-operator FM expansion module, I believe, for one of the Electone organs that's quite rare. But it kind of popularized 8-operator FM to, I'd say the masses, but probably not so much because of the numbers that it sold. However, in recent years, Yamaha has kind of come back with its FM, with the Montage and of course the MODX, which takes that whole FM engine, just puts it into a single unit. And of course, we've got the Reface DX as well. Now, I understand you've worked with all three of those machines.
Yes. It's a funny story, actually. After FS1R, you left one out. You left out the DX200.
Oh, I did, yes. That's true.
And the only reason why I mention that is because so from basically DX7 through AN and DX200, I basically worked on, I won't say everything that came out of their Pro Synth division, but pretty much everything. So, but those were the last two official products I worked on, and when I went on sabbatical, basically getting on with the rest of my life, having a family and all that kind of stuff. And so what was interesting is I still go to NAMM regularly, and I'm still very friendly with all the Yamaha guys. And over the time when I was doing this is, I did stuff for Korg, I did stuff for Kurzweil, I did stuff for Ensoniq, I did some stuff for EMU. And so, I know all the guys and that stuff. So I always like to go to NAMM shows just for, meeting people and, seeing gear. And I remember hearing about Montage and the Reface DX, coming out. And so I went to the NAMM show where they had those out and was, playing around with them, and ran into my good friend Nate Cheddar, and I said to him, first thing I said to him, "Hey Nate, how's it going?" "Yeah, well, it's going." So I just looked at him straight in the eye and said, "Dude, you guys released FM products and didn't call me? My number hasn't changed in 15 years. And he smiled. He goes, "I have a project for you." Now, truth be told, part of that was my fault because while Montage and Reface were still in development, they had this big 40th anniversary celebration here in LA. And I was at that, and Nate at that time said, "I have some stuff I think you might be interested in." And I don't remember what happened, but I never followed through to call him, so it's not really all his fault. But I neglected to follow up for whatever reason. But yeah, so they introduced those two products that have FM implementations, and they're really both very interesting for a couple of reasons. Reface is very interesting because of how they implemented it. It's a lot more versatile than people think. And one of the things that Nate talked to me about at that NAMM show was, he said, Yamaha's got all this great history, but we don't have any official content on anything on how to program it or approach it. Would you be interested in doing something for us? And he talked to me about what was going to become the Soundmondo platform and the Yamaha synth page on it. And that came into me starting to do my tutorial series. So as part of the Yamaha synth website and with associated libraries and examples through Soundmondo, we put together a quote official Yamaha series of FM programming techniques and stuff. And so I started doing that on Reface, and it was very well received. We did a lot of patches for it, and it covers a ridiculous breadth of timbres that you wouldn't anticipate from a 4-op engine, but it has to do with the fact that they're that square wave, saw wave feedback, and a couple of unique algorithms. And this is the thing that some people don't understand. Just having an onboard effects chip, even if it doesn't do a lot, does a lot. So we did that full project, and then did the same thing for Montage, explaining FMX, because FMX is the strict FM side of an FS1R. Then that got me officially back into doing development voices for all the various firmwares that came up as they added new features. So starting with the 2.5, was it 2.5? Anyway, the last two firmware updates, I did contributing voices for again, and such. So yeah, so I'm sort of back in the fold.
And it seems FM is making another comeback, because it never goes away. It just kind of fades away, and then something new happens. We for example, we get the SY and the TGs with the addition of AWM and AFM, and then you have the FS1R, which is extra operators and formant shaping. Now we have Montage MODX with the FMX engine, the Reface in that nice little compact unit. And there are whispers and rumors that other companies are working on FM synthesizers. Korg have got the Volca, the little tabletop thing that even reads DX7 SysX. As somebody who is in at that level that you are, where do you think FM can go next? Or does it have a future?
Oh, I think it has a future. I think the reason why it's still around is because, I believe it is, of all the things out there, it's the sweet spot of versatility versus complexity. And I say that because of the context of what I do as a sound designer. Anybody who just wants to do whatever, okay? There's a famous, Wendy Carlos quote, which is, this is a paraphrase, but it's like, the best thing about additive synthesis is that you can create anything. The bad news is you have to create everything. So if you think about the context of I can control an infinite number of harmonics with an infinite number of staged envelopes to make whatever movement I want with any controller, yeah, you can make any sound in the world, you know. It's one of the reasons why I wish I had a GDS system or a synergy with a programmer. But the time is ridiculous, okay? So FM inhabits a really nice space for me, which is I can get so much of that core level of control without having to do that much work. Now, it's more work than an analog synth, but an analog synth or subtractive synthesis or any of these other types of synthesis don't give you the timbre space they have in FM. So for me, it's always going to be around because unbeknownst to many people is the techniques that it uses can sound like whatever the hell you want it to. One of the things that's quite interesting is that, you know, I've been programming my SY for, 27 years. I can pretty much make it sound like whatever the hell I want to. And if you've ever gone up to the SY group on Facebook or seen some of the postings on YouTube, FM can be virtual analog. It can be Gen 1, shut up, don't play electronic piano 1 preset again, electric piano sound. It can mimic physical modeling. It can do all these things. And it does so in a manner that is so computationally efficient that it has a lot of interest. I do a lot of things with Montage that are, the biggest strength about Montage is less the FM engine, because there's some significant limitations it has. It has some significant things that the SY doesn't, but what it has is the real-time controllability of so many important parameters, which none of their other systems have. So, you know, I have stuff on the Montage that it's going to sound really weird. It sounds more, I can make it sound more like a VP1 than a VP1 does. And it takes a lot less effort for me to do it. Okay. Now, obviously, I have an experience and background with all those things to be able to do that. But the point is that it's capable of it. And so when you see things like FM7 and FM8 that are available as soft synths and, you know, all the Dext and all these other kinds of things, it's just so easy to implement, and it's got a huge range. And if you take the time and don't fall into the stereotype, I mean, you get a level of control you don't get in other synthesis systems with so much less effort, okay, and create anything from, I can make you the biggest, fattest, silkiest, you know, analog sample hybrid string patch all in FM, okay, and I can also, you know, make a high index sound that's going to take your head off, you know, and then you can go and do real subtle shifting stuff that Eno did in, you know, music for airports, you know. It's, you know, and there's not that many synthesis systems that can literally go from 0 to 1 million and back with a moderate amount of input.
Manny, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear your insights into this, to your experience and your history. So thank you ever so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, no worries. And here, let me play you out with something.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Before you go, make sure you visit the Sound on Sound podcast page at soundonsound.com/podcasts, where you can explore all the other great content playing across the other channels. I'm Rob Puricelli, and this has been a failed muso production for Sound on Sound.